Okay, beautiful listener, I want you right now to picture your biggest, most exciting goal that you have right now, the one that really lights you up. You got it? Okay, now picture the kind of person that achieves that goal. Okay, now here's my question. Are you that kind of person right now? My guest today is going to teach you how to change your personality in order to achieve your goals. Dr. Shannon Sauer-Zavala is a clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychology at the University of Kentucky. She is the lead developer of a new treatment approach that helps people shift their personality traits to address common mental health problems. So she's going to talk to us about how we can shift our personalities away from things like anxiety or depression, but also towards how to achieve our goals with, for example, getting up early to work out instead of hitting the snooze button, or how to stop emotional eating, or how to connect with people better and cultivate better relationships. Dude, I learned so much from this conversation, and I know you will too. Check it out.
It's time to get your head out of your ass and start creating a life of no regrets. Whether you want to lose weight, get rich, or manifest a hot threesome on the beach, you're gonna want to turn this up. This is Goals, Grit, and some woo-woo shit with your host, best-selling author and professional butt kicker, Una Duncan.
Welcome to Shannon Sauer-Zavala. Thank you so much for being here, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so the first thing I want you to tell me is, why do we need an update on personality testing? Because I love doing things like the Myers-Briggs and the strengths testing and all that sort of stuff. So tell me why those aren't going to give us our best data about ourselves.
Most of the common personality tests that we have access to online are not based in science. They're like kind of commercially packaged, so they're fun to take. And they're often really face valid, which means that they produce a result that seems really like, oh yeah, that sounds like me, but they don't do a very good job predicting like future behavior. So one thing that's really concerning is that the Myers-Briggs is one of the most popular sort of like tests that place you in terms of like what careers would be a good fit for your aptitudes, right? There's absolutely no predictive power of the Myers-Briggs. It does not predict job success at all.
Wow. So, because we've used this in my company where we have people do the Myers-Briggs and then we think, oh, okay, you're a detail-oriented person. Let's put you in charge of tracking this data, or you're an extrovert. Right. So let's get you chatting to clients. And you're saying all of that is actually bullshit. The extrovert could be just as good as the data and vice versa. Like, are you telling me that the Myers-Briggs is about as accurate as like a Facebook poll that's like, which Friends character are you?
I mean, it's a little bit more accurate than that, but when it has been, so it hasn't been tested much by actual personality scientists. It's more of like a commercial product. And it, when it has been tested, it doesn't really stand up as well as, like the 5-factor model of personality, or the Big Five, which is like kind of the gold standard, like in academic settings, personality test.
Ooh, okay. Can you tell me more about that? What's the Big Five?
Yeah, so the Big Five, so fun. The Big Five basically suggests that like every way that we can describe people can be boiled down to these big 5 broad overarching traits. And the way that the Big Five was first developed is like psychologists in like, I want to say like 1910, they combed through a dictionary and pulled out all the adjectives that can be used to describe people: grouchy, positive, excitable, energetic, and grouped them into categories. And basically, like, as you reduce and reduce and reduce all these words, it just ends up like the lowest common denominator is 5. This has been replicated across cultures using really sophisticated statistical techniques. And so you're probably wondering what they are.
I am.
It's like the next obvious question. As I say the names of these traits, you will see that they need like a publicist to like compete with the Myers-Briggs, because they are not really made for people. They're made for research psychologists. So the first one is neuroticism. And that's your tendency to experience negative emotions. People differ on that, right? It's on a continuum with what we call emotional stability. But basically, like, some people are just more prone to anxiety, more prone to sadness, more prone to anger. And some people are just like, rolls off my back. And importantly, there's no like right way to be on that trait, because there are certainly downsides to being really high in neuroticism. It's associated with like mental health difficulties, but like It's also not great to have like no neuroticism, because then you don't, then you're like putting yourself in danger. The second one is extroversion, which is a lot of times people think of extroversion as like sociability, but really it's broader than that. It's like your energy and your sort of tendency to experience positive emotions, and being kind of social and outgoing kind of fits within that umbrella. In contrast to being more introverted, just being more measured, more quiet, prefer alone time. Then there's agreeableness versus antagonism. And so, agreeableness is like empathy and tender-mindedness and like really caring about other people, right? And then it's on a continuum with antagonism, which sounds really bad, but it's also like there's no right or wrong way to be here too. If you're too agreeable, then you're like the doormat that everyone is like, hey, can you help me move? Even though it's very inconvenient for you. Whereas like being a little bit assertive goes a long way. The next one is conscientiousness versus disinhibition. And so this is like the person that follows through, the person that, is organized, the person that's like high achieving, on a continuum with being more spontaneous, maybe a little bit more absent-minded, having trouble following through on things. And then the last one is openness. And this is like openness to ideas, openness to like aesthetics, so like art and beauty, appreciation of music. And so people differ on that too. And those are the big five.
Wow. And I know that your work is about I'm assuming it has to do with the big five, but I know that your work is about helping people shift their personality traits in order to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. Do I have this right?
That's right. Yeah. So another big thing that I think like gives me pause with commercially available personality tests is that they assume your type is your type and that you are always going to be that way because personality is static. And that doesn't fit the research at all. So, when you look at big population studies, you see that personality changes over time, usually in like a healthier direction. So people tend to be less neurotic. They tend to be more agreeable, more conscientious, surprisingly, like more open when you look at the data as they age. I know that doesn't really check out like.
So in general, we get better with age, or is it right to
we
think
get better
of it as
with
better?
age?
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, I think like, in terms of like how we conventionally think of things, yes, we get better with age. And within that change, there's great variability. So some people change a ton and some people stay pretty static.
That's so interesting. Is there any way to predict who will change as they get older and who stay static?
I'm a treatment developer, right? So I do clinical trials to test treatment for anxiety, depression, and more recently borderline personality disorder, which is like a really stigmatized condition unfairly. And we've been working on a treatment to target personality domains. And the data that we have suggests that this sort of like natural change in personality that we see, we can speed it up. We can see considerable changes in as few as 12 weeks.
Wow. So tell me if I've got this right. If you are dealing with someone with borderline personality disorder, and for example, I'm not sure if this is true because I don't know anything about this, but they're really high on neuroticism. You are saying that you've got a treatment that can help scale down their neuroticism personality trait and therefore reduce their borderline personality disorder. Do I have this right?
Yeah, exactly. So we can engage these personality traits, right? See them change over time, and that those changes actually predict changes in like the symptoms that are causing impairment for folks.
So how can you change a personality trait?
I love this question because it fits with my research, and then it also fits with my own experience as like a former incredibly lazy person. The first step, I think, is like identifying what's important to you. So we always start with having people identify their values. A lot of people kind of like know what they value. It's sort of in there, but they don't take the time to like really write it down. And so we break values down into 11 different domains. There's like family relationships, partner relationships, parenting, and friendships. And then there's like more like career or personal growth, like education or career. Then there's like leisure and health and wellness. And so we ask people to really reflect on like your ideal self. Like, what is your ideal self? Like, who do you want to be in each of these areas, right? I think that's really important to do at the outset, because you can set whatever goals you want, but if they're not connected to something that's important to you, then you're already don't have the motivation to do it, right? If you're setting your goals because someone else is like, oh, like everyone should do this, like that's not really going to stick. So that's where we start, is like identifying the right goals.
Well, that's interesting, because when I was reflecting on what you do, I have this theory, and you can tell me if I'm totally full of shit, that if you have a goal, it's because part of you recognizes your inherent potential to achieve that goal, and that you are wanting to fulfill that potential, and that's the desire for the goal. And then I'm like, so if I have to change my personality to achieve that goal, that doesn't quite fit. I feel like my goals would already be in sync with my personality in a way. Is that not true?
Yeah, I think that's like kind of the conventional way to think about it, right? That's like the Myers-Briggs way to think about it, which is like you should do the things that like you are already good at or you already have an aptitude for. And like, I think that that's like not very empowering. I think it's more fun to sort of be like, I want to be, you know, a really successful academic. Like that's my goal. I don't think that was like always my goal, because what little girl is like, oh, I want to be a really successful academic. But I mean, when I think about like, you know, my sort of situation growing up with a single parent and like not having a lot of money and not having a lot of like economic advantages, it would be really easy for me to kind of think about that sort of like shy, lazy kind of like personality and kind of stop there, right? Versus thinking like, actually, I want to prove people wrong. Like I will cultivate the person that I need to be to like do this thing.
Ah, I love this. Now, Shannon, you've said lazy twice. And as your coach, by the way, I know Shannon because she's in my program, I have to talk about that. So tell me about your evolution. Do you still consider yourself a lazy person?
No.
So what happened?
I'm
Tell
like
us.
off the chart conscientious, like inbox zero kind of person. In fact, like when I tell my graduate students that I used to be lazy and messy, they don't believe me. They're like, yeah, sure. I always start with like kind of the example of being a person that like, I mean, just like skipped class all the time in high school. Like I actually failed math for the year and had to retake it to my senior year. And, then, you know, I went to college, and what I love about this, like, just to kind of preface this, is that like nothing major happened. Like it was all these little tiny changes over time that became this upward spiral. So like anyone can do this. It doesn't have to feel overwhelming. So I was in this like psychology class, just intro to psych, and ended up taking my first like little test and went to go get the grade from the TA. And she was like, you did really well on this. Most people don't. You should consider majoring in psychology. And I was like, okay, sure. And so it was that like feedback that it like made me feel good. Right. And I mean, you talk in your book about reinforcement, right? So that's like reinforcing. You do something and you get a positive response. You're more likely to do that again. The other piece that I think comes with this is like how we frame our identity. So like, am I a person that's good at psychology? You know, yes, that was something that I told myself. And so I started like just really making more of an effort in that class, and then signed up for more psychology classes. And in those classes, I did really well. I was definitely still shitting the bed in like all my other classes, but psychology was great. And I saw myself as like a person that I could help other people succeed. And so I was really getting a lot of feedback there and a lot of like praise from my instructors in those courses. So there was like a shift in my identity where I really saw myself in this way, and this reinforcement that kept me going. So that's like positive reinforcement. Something good happens. Then like around my junior year, I was like, you know what, this psychology thing is working out. I think I'm going to go to graduate school for it, and got the pretty difficult feedback that like with my overall GPA, I probably wouldn't get in. And that was a real bummer. And I felt so guilty. And guilt is an uncomfortable state, right? And so negative reinforcement happens when we take away something that's crappy. And so the way to get rid of your guilt, like the way it's supposed to work, is that you you change your behavior, right? And so that was really motivating for me too. And so I really started to apply myself in my other classes, and was like, just by like the skin of my teeth, was able to get my GPA over 3.5, which is sort of like a cutoff unofficially that like graduate programs will look at. And so obviously like getting into graduate school was a big boon. And then like in graduate school, science is like a team sport basically. And so other people were counting on me to do things. And while I might not have started out very conscientious, I did really, really care about other people. And so that was sort of this motivator of like, well, I can't let other people down. So when other people are counting on me, and I just kept getting reinforced and felt like I'm really good at this, and really kind of threw myself into it. And so it was all these small changes that changed how I thought about myself or my identity, and like really paying attention to the consequences. In this case, there were this positive and negative reinforcement that helped me kind of keep doing those things because they worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for example, in my book, I have people really picture what are the consequences if you don't change your habits today? What's that going to look like in 5 years, 10 years? And what would it be like if you nailed your habits starting today? What's that fork in the road look like? So you're saying if people are continually reinforcing these realities, it's going to start to create different personality traits. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you can shift your personality. So I think it's worthwhile to back up and kind of just define personality. Personality is your characteristic way of thinking and behaving. And while the idea of changing your personality is like, that seems hard. My personality is my personality. We change our perspective and we change our behavior all the time. And if we do that in a way that's sustained, next time we take a personality test and the questions are like, do you generally finish what you start? You can accurately answer, well, yeah, I generally do, because I do that now. And I've been doing that for the past 10 years.
Yeah. And I see this happen all the time in the MFA, right? People do completely shift their identity because they watch themselves like, holy shit, I actually have been working out consistently. I guess I'm someone who works out now. Oh my gosh. That feels like a completely different identity, and maybe a shift on their personality trait of, is it conscientiousness? Would that be the right trait?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me about, I would love to back up that particular situation. So if you have someone, and I'm sure neither you or I know anyone like this, but if someone who is like, I'm really lazy, I hate working out, I'm not a morning person, I'm too tired, my genetics are in the way, blah, 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 blah. I'm too busy, this is not a priority for me, et cetera, et cetera. But they also feel like they want to be someone who's energetic and athletic and all these things, but they just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm so not that right now. What would be like step one for that?
Yeah. So I would call to attention, right, that all of those things are thoughts, right? Like, I'm lazy. I don't have time for this. I mean, one that I can definitely endorse is like, I worked really hard today, so I don't feel like cooking.
Yeah.
Like those are, I deserve to order in.
Oh yeah. That's a big one.
Those are right. Yeah, right. Those are all thoughts, and thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are, it's kind of this narrative that we tell ourselves. And so I would ask people to kind of pay attention to those thoughts and see if they are giving themselves permission to stay stuck, basically. And, I'm a CBT therapist, so cognitive behavioral therapy. And so the first piece is like, well, what could you tell yourself instead? And it's not just positive thinking, because if you told yourself, I'm a go-getter that gets everything done, you're going to be like, BS. And, that doesn't work either. So you have to think about, well, it's not that I can't get up with my alarm. Like, it's not that I literally cannot.
If you had an early morning flight, you get up. Yeah.
You get up. Right. So like, what is getting in the way? And then when we think about behavior change, we have to think about like, what is a small step, right? Because a lot of times people get overwhelmed with like how to get from A to Z, when like, we just want to get to like
A to B.
I'm going to mix my metaphors, but like, yeah, A to B or like 8.5. But, because any of that is like, it's still better than you were yesterday, and that's great, right? And once you do that small thing and you get reinforced for that, it's going to be so much easier to do the hard thing or the next thing, take the next step, right? So like, if you it's probably not realistic to go from like being pretty sedentary to exercising 7 days a week. And like that probably shouldn't be your goal. Your goal should be like, I've worked with patients where like the goal, because they've been so sedentary, is to like walk to the mailbox each day. And like, if they weren't doing that before, then like, let's celebrate that, like high fives. That's great. And then we think about how we can push that a little bit more. So I think identifying your starting place is really important, recognizing that like what works for somebody maybe isn't going to be appropriate for you. And that's okay. The thing that we work on a lot with conscientiousness is like the delay of gratification, because the snoozing the alarm in the morning, right? Like that feels really good in the short term. And people that are not super conscientious, or they're a little bit more disinhibited, they are much more oriented towards the pleasure in the moment, and they don't think about the long-term consequences. So that's why I really like what you said, like where in your book, you encourage people to think about like, well, if I snooze my alarm today, what am I going to feel like later today or tomorrow or a year from now if I do that every day, right? And if I get up and it's cold and it's raining, like that sucks. That's going to hurt in the moment. That's pain in the moment. But like, what do I get in the long term? I think about this. I know you talk to like a lot about like drinking alcohol, right? Like I am an old lady now. So like if I like get a hangover concurrently to drinking a glass of wine, but I have to remember that, right? Because it's like really fun in the moment to like be out with my girlfriends. But if I think about like the long term, like can kind of take a step back from the pleasure in the moment and think about like where I want to be in the long term, it doesn't really matter as much.
Yeah, actually, I just interviewed a great guest about this, and he talked about how we are always trying to regulate our dopamine. And when we have a drink, our dopamine goes soaring up, but then it kind of crashes down. However, when we do something like a hard workout, the dopamine goes down, like it sucks, right? But then it goes way up because, again, we're trying to regulate, which I thought was such a good image of why we want to force ourselves to do these fucking hard workouts, or, all these things are kind of unpleasant. Yeah. Okay. So let me see if I'm getting this right. So let's say I'm someone who identifies as lazy. I'm someone who, really wants to hit the snooze button, blah, blah, blah. But I want to be someone who's energetic and athletic and blah, blah, blah. So then the way I would change that is then I start to watch the thoughts, question whether they're true. That's going to give me a little tiny behavior that I can do. And then once I start doing that little tiny behavior, then next time I'm filling out a personality form and it says, do you move your body every day? I can be like, yeah, I go to the mailbox. That is true. And then I've moved a little step along the continuum of conscientiousness. Am I getting it right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So a lot of this sounds like personal development, which to me has a very different connotation to changing my personality. I just find I've got this little resistance to the idea of changing my personality. I guess I'm like precious about my personality, but I'm all for self-improvement. What is the difference, or is there a difference?
Yeah. So I think people are precious about personality because it's like, you think that it's like your preferences or like your sense of humor. And like, it's not really, like, it's like your tendency to experience negative emotions, your tendency to follow through, your tendency to either be like assertive, aggressive, or doormatty, right? It's your tendency to like appreciate art and beauty, right? And all of those things are like skills, right? Or competencies. They're things that we can change, and a lot of people would want to. And I like the idea, like I like the like sort of extremeness of changing your personality, because I do think a lot of people are like, well, I'm an INFJ, so like I just can't. And like that sucks, right? Like it sucks to be like, oh, well, I couldn't possibly date you because you're a ENF, whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so sometimes it's really clear what personality traits we need for certain outcomes, like the conscientiousness or whatever. But sometimes it's not as clear. Like if I'm like, okay, my goal is to have the #1 podcast in the world, then I'm like, okay, well, what personality traits do I need to do differently? Like how would I figure that out?
Yeah, that's great. So what I would do is look for folks that are successful with your goal. right? People that are like, if I want to be a really successful podcaster, or I want to be a boss, or I want to be like a good, like a patient parent. It's definitely on my list. Like look at other people and see what they're doing. Like, how would you describe them? Right. So like, you know, I think my neighbor is a really good parent and she doesn't yell, right? Like she kind of waits a beat before responding to her kids, right? And so that kind of like, to me, like that feels like sort of lower neuroticism. You're less reactive. A lot of times with parenting, it's like high neuroticism where it's like, I have to control the situation. And it like, you know, kind of like a lower agreeableness, but usually more neuroticism. Like I'm grumpy or I just like I'm stressed by what I think might happen. You're going to have a tantrum. So I like overcorrect. And so here, like, if we're trying to sort of reduce neuroticism, like being less emotional or reactive is what will help me be a better parent. Then I can think about like, well, what is my baby step, right? Like, can I, you know, can I tell myself, well, there have been times in the past when I have not overreacted. Like, can I remind myself of that? Can I, when I am noticing myself getting dysregulated, can I walk outside? Can I try something else? Can I try these behaviors? And then when you have success, right? Like I see this with my patients that I work with, right? Well, sometimes we talk about parenting and it's like, I saw my son and it looked like he was going to have a meltdown. And then I yelled at him preemptively because I was trying to control the situation. And then he did have a meltdown. And that when I hold back and I don't, you know, overreact preemptively, then it doesn't end up being a meltdown. And that's the reinforcement, right? So that makes it more likely that you won't overreact next time because it worked.
Right.
Not overreacting worked this time.
So it's about finding the baby step that's in the direction that you want and then reinforcing that baby step or feeling the reinforcement of it.
Yeah. And recognizing too that sometimes it's like trial and error, right? Like that's the way reinforcement works. Like if you imagine that you're a rat pushing a bunch of levers, it's like some of the levers are going to give you a pellet and some of them aren't, right? So you have to figure out like and calibrate your behavior that way and recognize that that's natural too.
Now, I'm understanding this as far as developing personality traits and moving towards what we want. But what about moving away from what we don't want? Like you started with the example of accelerating personality trait change for someone with borderline personality disorder. I'm not sure if many listeners could relate to that, but I'm guessing a lot of them could relate to anxiety or depression. What if you wanted to accelerate your personality change to alleviate some of that?
Yeah. So like neuroticism is kind of the personality trait that I think would probably be most associated with anxiety and depression. And the behavior that comes with both of those conditions is, I mean, it varies from person to person, the exact behavior, but the behavior pattern is avoidance, right? So in depression, we tend to withdraw. We tend to like stop doing the things that we used to find pleasurable. With anxiety, we, you know, take like social anxiety, for example, we maybe don't go to places where other people are because we don't want to feel those emotions, right? Or with panic disorder, we don't go to places where I don't go to the supermarket because I can't escape and it makes me really, makes me really anxious. Basically, like the process that's happening is that people sort of learn over time, like the thought is, I can't handle my emotions. They're too uncomfortable. I can't do hard things. Basically, like that's the thought process if we want to really like boil it down. And then the behavior that comes with that is like, so I'm going to do things so that I don't feel those emotions in the first place. And then my life gets more and more closed off. And anytime you don't do something, because it might make you feel anxious, you're like reinforcing the notion that that thing was dangerous. Otherwise, why would you have been avoiding it? So then the next time you encounter something similar, you're anxious, right? It's like a cycle of avoidance that makes you more and more neurotic over time, makes you experience emotions more. So the baby step is figure out what you're avoiding and then think about like, okay, like maybe you're not ready to go to a party, but could you like make small talk with the cashier at the supermarket? So we're thinking about like what that would look like, but how do you counter that avoidance that's sending the message? It's not okay to feel.
So you would first take action at the behavior level, not necessarily the thought level? Or do you think most of the time these people aren't aware of the thoughts? They're just are able to see the behaviors? Where do we start?
Usually I start with the thoughts and do basically some psychoeducation on like the like adaptive function of emotion, right? Like, why do we have anxiety? It tells us something's important and we should prepare. Why do we have sadness? It tells us that our life is not, it comes after a loss, right? So it could be like a literal loss, like someone died, or it could be a loss like, I thought I was going to be here in my life and I'm not there yet. And that makes me feel sad, right? Like anger helps us stand up for ourselves so that we don't get walked all over, right? Like all of these like negative emotions have a really important message, but because people find them really uncomfortable, there is this narrative that's like, I hate this feeling. I'm going to lose control. I can't handle it. I'm going to go crazy, right? Like there's all these thoughts that go with that. So we point that out and we try to replace those thoughts with, it's normal to feel. Emotions are temporary, right? So it's like that little bit mindset shift that then is like, okay, like now let's test it out. Let's do the behaviors.
Wow. There's a couple of things that are coming up. I once had someone tell me, and you'll know if this is true or not, that an emotion usually only lasts like 30 seconds. When you said it's temporary, is that what you're referring to? Is that right? Or did I just pull that out of my ass?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'll be the first to admit that I don't know. I mean, I think that my patients would describe them as lasting longer, kind of depending on what the situation is. But like they are temporary because like, think about the last time you were embarrassed.
Oh,
you have it in your mind?
Oh, I have so many in my mind. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Are you still feeling embarrassed right now today?
I mean, when I think of it, I feel like I'm getting a little fleshy. Yes.
But like a moment, were you thinking about it?
No. I don't live my life being like, oh
right.
gosh, no.
Yeah. So that's every emotion, right? That it's like, we felt so many things across our lives and eventually, and usually, within a couple hours, we're not like that like acute, just like, oh, I want to crawl in a hole, is gone.
And then the other thing that made me think of is I have a friend who says that every time someone gets triggered, you should be like, well, you're welcome, because it's an opportunity to work through those emotions and therefore expand your life. Do you think that's true, that we should be welcoming triggers, or do you think we need to protect ourselves from that sometimes?
Both. And so I think that like, if a situation is actually safe, then by all means we should push ourselves, right? But there are times when we're triggered because it's like, oh yeah, this is dangerous. This is unsafe. This reminds me too much of a situation. And like my intuition tells me get out of here. And so that's one of the things that that I work with patients is like trying to understand like how realistic is your fear, and like, let's push around that. I always give the example of like, imagine you're in a park with a friend and like this puppy runs up to you and you are like, oh my God, a puppy, it's so cute. And your friend jumps up on a park bench and is like horrified, right? And that might be that. So the friend is clearly triggered, right? And that might be like factually, an incorrect response because this puppy is not dangerous. But then it makes perfect sense when you find out that this friend has been like mauled by a dog in the past, like when they were a kid, right? And so I think like it can be really helpful for people to like start from a place of understanding the function of their behavior, right? Like, I mean, sometimes like, so I think about like, all of these like avoidance behaviors come from the function of like, I'm trying to protect myself. It's just that like they are outdated. They don't serve us anymore. Right. And you can think about that in the conscientiousness or like the health domain, right? Where it's like, if I tell myself, oh, I'm just a lazy person, like I won't be disappointed when I fail at this health
workout
change
program.
too.
Yeah.
It's just who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. What about someone who identifies as an emotional eater?
Yeah. So, guilty. Yeah. So I think this is really important, right? So like understanding why we eat emotionally, right? And so like this again is like, seems like a maybe a disinhibited process, like an impulsivity or like a lack of conscientiousness, but it also is a neuroticism process. So like a feeling strongly. And so when people describe like binge eating, like if we're talking like eating disorder territory, most often they describe feeling numb while they're eating. And that's that negative reinforcement, right? That's a vast improvement over ruminating about your fight with your partner. And so like, I try to get people away from beating themselves up because nobody's ever beat themselves up enough to change their behavior. It just doesn't work like that. You just feel crappy. And then when you feel crappy, your coping strategy is to eat. So then you eat again. It like kind of facilitates that cycle. So usually what I do, so if that's the function of the eating is to regulate emotions, then it's like, what are healthy ways to regulate emotions, right? And of course, like all of this stuff exists on a continuum. If you are experiencing a ton of distress and impairment, like you might need the help of a therapist to kind of learn coping strategies. You know, it could be like if it is like not happening a ton and it is like at parties and it's like sort of socially sanctioned, like that might not be impairing to you, right? And so like that's okay. Like maybe it's eating in response to like it's somebody's wedding. Sure. Like maybe that's not problematic. So it's kind of figuring out where you fall. And I think like for most people probably in the middle, I think the stuff that you do around just like baseline, just be less stressed out, so that you're like if your baseline is like here, right? I'm less stressed out. And then when something happens, you just, you're here versus if you're already up here and then something happens, you're going to need something really powerful to
help calm you down,
push those emotions down.
Yeah, for sure. There's so often someone's like, I just can't stop snacking. I'm like, that's not a snacking problem. That's a life problem that you're trying to cure through snacking.
Right.
Do you have any stories of anyone that you've worked with who's really changed their personality through these techniques and how it's changed their life?
I will talk about agreeableness versus antagonism because we haven't really talked about that one yet. We've talked about, neuroticism and negative emotions, and we've talked about conscientiousness and like habits and following through. And I think, some of the most powerful change comes from changing how you relate to other people. And so a lot of the people that I work with have, they are, less agreeable, kind of surly, or kind of lonery because they're trying to protect themselves. It's like I'm going to leave you before you leave me kind of thing. And all of it is about trust and how we perceive other people. And it makes good sense when you consider like that they may have had like childhoods where they were not sort of given consistent, like positive regard, or maybe, think about like in a relationship, maybe they were cheated on. And so now their guard is up. There's like a ton of reassurance seeking and a ton of like just mistrust. Right. And so I've worked with a lot of people that, that like have engaged in like bad relationship behavior, like just texting people, like threatening that they might hurt themselves if they, if their partner leaves, things like that. Yeah. So like some of the people that I work with a lot of people with like kind of your baseline anxiety and depression, and these are sort of more extreme cases. But what I love doing are like trust exposures. So basically like the behavior change, like the only way to become more trusting is to trust, which is crappy. But it's basically like what you have to do. So we do these exercises where we call them dimensions of trust, and we have folks identify a person in their life and then rate them on like, doesn't talk about me behind my back, would pick me up from the airport if I asked them to, like would help me move, like wouldn't cheat on me. And that helps people see that like trust isn't like black and white. And then the behavior change is like, throw somebody a bone, like see what they can do. Ask them to pick you up from the airport. And then if they show up, you learned that they can be trusted, at least in that capacity. So now why don't you try telling them about a feeling that you're having? Because people hate doing that. It's like vulnerable. So why don't you try that? Right. And if they don't invalidate you, like, oh, that's really important data. Right. So people, a lot of times, like when people engage in like kind of like walled up, bad behavior interpersonally, it's because they're trying to protect themselves from something. And so, by building trust and like making these changes, that can like get people to become more agreeable over time. And that has huge impact on people's lives because relationships are such an important thing that we all need.
Oh, for sure. So did you have a specific client that you really moved along that spectrum of its agreeableness?
Yeah, agreeableness is like the big 5 name for it. But yeah, you know, I'm thinking of one person that she was a college student here at the university where I work, and she experienced depressive episodes, and like when she was down, she would just didn't want to tell anybody about it because she just didn't trust that they would support her. So she would just like ghost people or cancel plans or just like not show up to things and really isolate. And so we worked a ton on like, well, what would it be like for you to just like tell your friend? What do you think they would do? And doing that dimensions of trust, like the thinking form, she was like, yeah, I mean, I guess they really haven't given me any reason to think that they would do X, Y, and Z. And then we practiced like when she would go home to visit her family, like they were kind of invalidating. She would like the exposure or the behavior change was just to be like, I really want to go to this movie, because like what she would do is like, not say anything and then be disappointed and then have it sort of be confirmed, like people don't care about me, right? So like, well, why don't you try? And so she wouldn't ask for what she needed because she was afraid that like, well, what if I ask for what I need and I don't get it? Well, it's like, you're definitely not going to get it if you don't ask. Mm-hmm. So like, let's try.
And in doing these little experiments, she started to trust people more and open up. And oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. I got an email for her. She graduated, and then I got an email from her maybe like 6 months later that was like, you know, I found a job. Like I have all these friends. Like things are going really well. And I always love that when people check out after.
So good. So good. I know that people are going to want to learn more about your work. What's the best way for people to learn more about this?
Yeah. So I think the best place is probably my website, which is www.personality-compass.com. And that will sort of link to like how to get in touch with me, or like to my research page with all my like journal articles that sort of support this work. And also like free downloads in terms of like, you want to try out the Dimensions of Trust form?
Oh, cool.
You can download it.
Nice. And what's a final thought for anyone listening to this thinking like, oh man, I would love to change my personality. I feel like I'm stuck in this zone and I would love to move it. Or what would you want everyone to know about their personalities and how to change them?
Yeah. So I guess my final thought would be, don't let a personality test that you took on the internet define who you could be. That personality is just a summary label of what we think and what we do. And like, those are completely changeable. And that you don't have to be stuck.
Amazing. Powerful stuff. Thank you so much for sharing this with me. It was fascinating.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That was so cool. I love the idea that our personalities aren't static and that in general, we tend to get better as we age. I thought that was so cool. And I think it's such a beautiful counterpart to all of the anti-aging propaganda that we see when it comes to our physical bodies. Our personalities are getting better no matter what's going on with our necks or whatever. And it's just so in alignment with a growth mindset, that belief that we can always learn new skills, or in this case, new personality traits. Right. So now I have some homework to figure out what personality traits are common among those with fantastically successful podcasts. And if you have any ideas for me, I'd love to hear them. Reach out at Una Duncan on Instagram, or listen, if you're not an Instagram person, I know I keep pushing that, you can reach out to me via my site. It's info@fitfeelsgood.com. Okay, I'll see you next week. Hey dude, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you can get the next one. And by the way, if you rate and review this podcast, it really helps me get found by other people who need some goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. And be sure to connect and DM me at Una Duncan on Instagram and let me know what you thought of the episode. Chat soon.